That's a very interesting one, but the more interesting one is the first I mentioned before, the one that is built into optics, which is built into optics, which in Middle Age is going to be called perspectiva, interestingly enough. The word optic doesn't exist. The optics is Greek term, optica, and only in Greek text it would appear as optica, but otherwise it is always referred to as perspectiva. What perspectiva means basically in translation is see through, seeing through. And the question which I would now raise is how, well, I would raise it twice, how the question here asked about perspective in the modern sense, the perspectiva artificialis, the artificial perspective of the 15th century and after, how is it related to optics? And how this particular background can be traced to perspective in such a way that you would understand the perspective in a way it was and should be understood. So now I'm going quite fast. I'll go to text. I'll start slides later. I'll show you slides, two slides. Let's go two slides. I wish. Make it more interesting to you. What I'm going to do is just start. The first thing first, we go back to beginning of my talk today almost with images. And I'm using two images in sequence which should really speak for themselves, should speak about the primary difference between the kind of overall nature of non-perspectival or pre-perspectival and perspectival space. What is happening in the structuring and organization of space in the visual domain. Not just painting, sculpture, but also architecture. And I would say architecture first to start with, because we'll need that later on. We're looking at Gothic charrette, the piece that goes around the car, the car chapels and so on. And I'm using that because it's very typical for the sense of the Gothic space or the pre-perspectival space. Basically what is happening there is a qualitative differentiation of the elements. Everything that is there has its own specific place in the topography of the whole. In other words, each column is where it's supposed to be. It's east or west, south, is represented or that, and so on. It's particular relation to the altar. So, in other words, you cannot very easily start to the substituting one for the other. Each piece has its own place. We may call, I cut a long story short, speak about that space, and of course we describe it as aggregate space, aggregate space, aggregate. I would choose rather different words because it goes straight into the meaning of it and the characteristics of the ground, Aristotelian very much, and that's it. Notion of place and speak about configuration of places. So the space, in fact, doesn't exist as a space. There is no such a thing as a space. It's kind of one thing that you can grasp, name, handle, and so on and so forth. We tend to speak about those things as spatial, of course, because there is a spatiality, but space may not be there in our modern terms, or in kind of, shall we say, perspectival, post-perspectival sense of that. What is there is spatiality in the configuration, which is the configuration of places. And the qualitative differentiation, the heterogeneity, the topography, the fixation to particular place in that overall arrangement is critical. Unlike the spaces that you would find later, when you're looking at some spiritual they are somewhere close to the almost middle of the century now, 15. And without much thought, you can see straight away the fundamental difference. It is as it were sublimated, elevated off the ground, as it were taken off or from the context and established in a kind of idealized rather than a universal manner, where the relations matter more than the meaning of the individual pieces. What is in between, how things are related. You know, that kind of relational structure which also is much more homogeneous. You can easily imagine a substituting pieces. One can stand for the other. And sometimes the pieces themselves are not important as much as the abstract topography, which is almost like a matrix with which you can play. And at that point, it's beginning to come close to the notion of space as space, because the space is already to such an extent constituted, established, and structured to a level of homogeneity that allows to, as it were, ignore the individual aspects, the differences, and the heterogeneity, and speak about one thing, which is space. Now, here we're looking at one of the first paintings that may be, and there is, I think, sensible agreement on that, first painting produced in the so-called correct method or legitimate method, sometimes referred to, the prospettiva legittima or construzione legittima, very often referred to as well, the legitimate construction. Basically, the first example of a proper artificial perspective. Masaccio, there are close to 1430 the pieces on the left side of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Now, what interests us is not really detailed analysis and interpretation. I'm just showing you this bit here. Because when you say space, and this is our question, what is really represented? What is represented is not a field, is not a landscape, is not a space of some imaginary kind. It's something very specific and very precise. It's a room to start with, and I would use the term with great emphasis. We already have a room. The space has been already represented as a room. So it's not a space, it's a room. That's something very special, very specific. By comparison with the space of the sea, of mountains, of, landscape, open scenes, urban scenes, we can go on and on. Garden, blah, blah, blah. Room is already very selective, highly tuned arrangement. And that's what is represented here. So we're dealing with double representation over there. How it all happens and what happens behind it, we don't have to worry about now. I'm just showing you the Albertian perspective, and we'll come back to it as we go in a circle. More or less, the primary structure consists of establishing a base, establishing the horizon, that's the height of your eye, establishing something which is called vanishing point, basically an extension of your eye, projection of the axis, the visual axis, to the plane on which you're projecting. And then eventually out of the comes what you see on the upper diagram on the right. If you take the vertical line and read the distance from there to the point, which is in fact a vanishing point as well, except it's called distance because it's a special vanishing point. The distance between the point and the vertical line, which is a projection of a 90 degrees projection in the projecting plane or the pictorial plane, you're dealing with the distance which separates you from the scene of representation. That's how it would be even constructed. And we can come back to it later again, but the construction basically consists of dividing the base into equal parts. So there is a sequence of equal increments. Then you put all the lines into the center point, the center vanishing point. What you then do is you choose basically one diagonal, and you can travel from the left bottom corner in a diagonal that you choose in